Let us continue our look at Luke. This time we're in Luke chapter 6, and we're looking at Sabbath and work part B. This time we're going to be beginning at verse 6. Luke chapter 6, verse 6. And going down from there. Grab your mobile device, grab your computer, grab your Bible itself. I've been reading from the King James. Let's look at Luke chapter 6, verse 6. And it came to pass also on another Sabbath that he entered into the synagogue and taught. And there was a man whose right hand was withered. And the scribes and Pharisees watched him, meaning they were watching Jesus, whether Jesus would heal on the Sabbath day, and they might find an accusation against him. Verse 8. But he knew their thoughts, and said to the man which had the withered hand, Rise up, stand forth in the midst. And he arose and he stood. Then said Jesus unto them, I will ask you one thing. Is it lawful on the Sabbath days to do good, or to do evil, to save life, or to destroy it? So, what is going on with this passage? We looked in our previous segment, and it really is an argument about Sabbath and work. So this is another instance of Jesus doing a healing on Sabbath. So the argument again is, what is lawful? What is Torahful on Sabbath? What does the Torah permit? Now, we have to accept that the Torah has an injunction that it is really serious to not work on Sabbath. Numbers has a man, the book of Numbers has a man, he collects sticks, and a man was executed for violating the Sabbath because he was told not to work. And he collects sticks and he's then executed for this. So the question is very serious that is being put forth to Jesus. Why are you doing what you're doing when it's Sabbath? It seems up to this point, or perhaps it had been practiced this way, that sitting pretty much idle and resting was the interpretation. So Jesus is challenging these things because there had been rules through the oral law, not the written law, but the oral law. So in a sense, what the oral law is doing is teaching additional rules in order to keep people alive, because we don't want to have a situation where somebody gets executed for violating Sabbath. So, to put credit to the sages and the Pharisees, they had the welfare of the Israelite people in mind. And we really need to give them that kind of credit, even though they seem hard-pressed to come against Jesus for an accusation. So go back to Luke chapter 6, verse 6. I want us to notice something. Prior to Jesus challenging the interpretation of Sabbath, what is he seen as doing? We talked about this back in our parts for Luke chapter 4. Jesus goes into the synagogue on a Sabbath day and teaches. So this is again very important because this is Jesus doing his life. But look at the next verse. Luke chapter 6, verse 7. There are scribes and Pharisees. So let's talk about the Pharisees first. We've talked about them previously. Are they from the house of Hillel? Are they from the house of Shammai? Those are two different houses, and they teach a little bit differently. So go back and look at our previous segments about Rabbi Hillel, Rabbi Shammai, and Rabbi Yeshua to see these things. So who's there from the Pharisees? Students of Hillel, students of Shammai, or both? We don't really know. And if we don't even know that the Pharisees actually had two different types of parties in their system and structure, we would think that it's just all one big group, but it isn't. But in addition to that, there are also scribes. Now, did they take and write down the Torah? Yes. But there's something bigger than that. These scribes are students and teachers of the Torah. So they're more learned than we give them credit. It takes an amount of learning we take for granted. So many people read and write today. But you go back to the ancient world, that's not necessarily the case. So it took a lot of learning to get them to where they would write the Hebrew. and get it onto the scroll and to do the transactions and understand it and go to courts of law and things of this nature. So they also, because they transcribed it and they practiced all these things, they could teach the Torah. They were students of it. So the argument about what is happening on Sabbath is found in verse 9. What is lawful? What does Torah permit? What is Torahful on Sabbath? So Jesus, through his question, is asking this right here. On Sabbath, is it Torahful to do good? I'm going to break it down again. On Sabbath, is it Torahful to do evil? I'm going to break it down again. On Sabbath, is it Torahful to save life? And one more time. On Sabbath, is it Torahful to destroy life? So Jesus is putting good and evil and saving life and destroying life up against each other to make a point. Doing good. You can go over to John chapter 7, verse 21 to 24. Circumcision is done on the Sabbath. Matthew chapter 12, verse 5. Priests work on the Sabbath. So, why do they work on the Sabbath? Well, if you look at Numbers chapter 28, verse 9 and 10, here's what it says. On the Sabbath day, 2 lambs of the first year without spot, and 2/10 deals of flour, a meat offering mingled with oil, and a drink offering thereof. This is the burnt offering of every Sabbath, beside the continual burnt offering and its drink offering. So, priests were commanded, according to Numbers 28, to work on the Sabbath. Let's look at saving life. In Matthew chapter 12, 11, and 12, Jesus puts forth a challenge. On the Sabbath, you do the work necessary to save the life of a sheep that has fallen into it. Luke chapter 14 and verse 5. So we'll probably not discuss this particular verse when we get to Luke 14. On the Sabbath, you do the work necessary to save the life of an ox or a donkey that has fallen in the pit. So thus, Jesus is applying the spirit of the written law to love God and to love others, which also includes animals, right? So here's the reality, and here are some notes that I have for the Torah. Doing good. Circumcision is doing good because it keeps the covenant of Abraham, which is found in Genesis 17. So it's commanded for the Abrahamic covenant to circumcise on the 8th day. If the 8th day arrives on a Sabbath, circumcision takes precedent over the Sabbath day because you have to do good to keep the covenant. Numbers 28, verse 9 and 10, we looked at that. There was sacrifice on Sabbath. Therefore, there was worship on Sabbath. So the priests sacrificed on Sabbath because worship and sacrifice was given on Sabbath, because sacrifice was commanded on the Sabbath. So, sacrificing for worship takes precedent over observing the Sabbath day because one commandment is found over the other. These are important questions because people will try to balance out what is going on. Why is Jesus saying these things? Because when you get down into these nuts and bolts, it really becomes an argument. What does the Torah permit? So, the practical use of rescue, which is in Deuteronomy 22, verse 4. Rescue of an ox or a donkey or a sheep or whatever the animal is. Because rescue is commanded. So, because rescue is commanded, it doesn't matter that Sabbath is also commanded. Rescue takes priority over the Sabbath day, just like sacrifice took precedent over the Sabbath day, just like circumcision took precedent over the Sabbath day. So, Jesus is teaching that the rescue of unhealthy people takes priority over not working on the Sabbath. This may seem like a crazy discussion to us, but these discussions still take place because they took place. What is lawful to do on Sabbath? Jesus is teaching that you don't violate Sabbath just to throw You don't violate Torah to do whatever you want on Sabbath. You don't violate Sabbath and make it unholy. If you're a Jew, these are the things that you do. But what can you do as a Jew on Sabbath? Do good. Save people. Rescue things. Sacrifice. These are written in the law. Pay attention to these things. So, in a sense, Jesus is arguing this. Doing good and saving life is the very essence of keeping Sabbath holy. That is an amazing thought, actually. So, in a sense, Jesus is arguing that the abstinence of doing good and the abstinence of saving life is in violation of keeping the Sabbath day holy, which is found in Exodus 20, verse 8. So Jesus is arguing for a proper, healthy, wholesome interpretation of keeping the Sabbath holy, doing good. So Jesus is saying that doing good and saving life are not work, because saving life and doing good are commanded in the Torah. So these are pretty powerful things. And sitting down here and arguing about what is Jesus teaching and what is Jesus not teaching, for the Christian church today, it's almost, why even go through this effort? But it is a very important thing, because in Jesus' day, what you practice as Christianity today did not exist. Jesus is bringing a new thought to the interpretive process of Torah. And what does it mean to live Torah on Sabbath? What does it mean to fulfill God's commands on Sabbath? This is pretty powerful, and it's pretty mind-blowing, and it is culturally changing when he's preaching this. But what these passages show in Luke is Jesus and his knowledge of Torah and his challenge to the interpretations of those things. But I want to close out with one other thing. Jesus does argue for the sanctification of Sabbath to maintain a proper fulfillment of Exodus chapter 20 and verse 8. Jesus does want Sabbath to be holy.